The Galactic Council saw the data, then everything changed. Part 1. The Unremarkable Species. The distress signal came from a dying ship on the edge of the Keth system, and I was the only analyst within range to answer it. I did not want to go. I had work waiting. 300 unread observation reports stacked in my queue, all of them about civilizations that mattered, the Veth Continuum's expansion drive, the Rho Collective's new weapons treaty, the slow and painful collapse of the Sarathi moon colonies. These were important things. These were the kinds of things that shaped the galaxy and appeared in the Council's annual summary documents and were read by people who made decisions. Instead, my navigation system had diverted me to a wreck. The ship turned out to be a Council survey drone, automated, no crew, badly damaged by a debris field it had drifted into after its guidance systems failed. There were no lives at risk, no emergency, no reason at all for an analyst of my level to have been pulled off course. The drone was sending out its signal because that is what broken equipment does. It calls for help long after help can make any difference, because no one ever taught it when to stop. I spent 4 hours in my suit collecting its memory cores from the floating debris. It was cold, methodical work, and I did it without enthusiasm, which is the only honest way to describe my general relationship with this posting at that period of my career. When I was back inside and the cores were drying on the processing rack, I checked the drone's registry log to see what route it had been running. Earth. The word meant almost nothing to me. I had to search the archive to recall the full designation. Third planet orbiting a single yellow star in a quiet arm of a mid-sized galaxy. One large natural satellite. Surface predominantly liquid water. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. Life-bearing, significantly, richly life-bearing, with one of the highest biodiversity indexes in the Council's planetary database. But the dominant species had achieved only basic spaceflight approximately 1 century prior by galactic standard reckoning, which placed them at a stage the Council's framework called precontact maturity. In simple terms, not ready, not remotely ready. The drone had been collecting passive observation data for 11 years before it was knocked off course by the debris field. 11 years of raw human data, communications intercepts, electromagnetic readings, atmospheric sampling results, and continuous population modeling projections, stored in the memory cores now sitting on my rack. I almost deleted it. The standard procedure for a Class 3 primitive civilization was a brief summary report, filed quarterly, reviewed by almost no one. I could have written such a report in 20 minutes. Population stable, technology advancing at predicted rate, no indicators of first contact readiness. Done. Signed. Archived. Forgotten. But as I was waiting for my navigation system to finish plotting my return course, I noticed a small orange flag attached to the drone's final data packet. The automated analysis system threw these flags up regularly, sometimes several per week. In my experience, they were almost always sensor glitches, atmospheric interference incidents, or artifacts of outdated modeling software that had not been updated to handle certain edge cases. I had cleared hundreds of these flags in my career, without finding anything of substance. I opened this one because I was waiting and had nothing else to do. There was no intuition involved, no professional premonition. I opened it the way you push a door that is already slightly ajar, not because you expect anything on the other side, but because it is there. The flag was about burial practices. I read the notation 3 times before I fully understood what the algorithm was saying. It had cross-referenced Earth's documented funeral and burial customs against the database entries for all 412 civilizations that had reached an equivalent stage of technological development. Of those 412 civilizations, not a single one had maintained the practice of burying personal objects, items with no material survival or informational value, with their dead past the early tribal period of development. It was a behavior that all known species eventually discarded as they became more socially complex. It required resources. It produced no measurable return, and over time the pressure of practical necessity consistently eliminated it. Humans were still doing it, extensively, across every continent, across every culture the drone had recorded, across every income level and social class. They buried photographs of people still living. They buried letters written in ink on paper. They buried jewelry that could have been passed to someone who could wear it. They buried small toys, sometimes worn smooth by years of a child's handling. They placed these objects in the earth with the people they had loved, and they covered them over, and they left them there, in the dark, where they would never be seen or used or read by anyone again. The automated analysis system had labeled this behavior anomalous persistence of irrational ritual beyond expected developmental transition point. I sat with what I was actually reading, instead of the label the system had given it. A letter written in someone's own handwriting, placed in the ground beside a person who could no longer read it. A photograph tucked into a space that would never see light again. A toy chosen with care, pressed into cold earth. These were not things done for survival. They were not done for social signaling in any way the Council's analysis framework recognized. They were done for reasons that did not translate neatly into any of the 47 categories of species behavior in the standard database. I filed the anomaly report. I marked it low priority. I told myself I was being thorough. What I was actually being, though I would not have admitted it to anyone, was unsettled. Something about the image, a letter in the dark, addressed to someone who was gone, sat in a part of my thinking that did not respond to the standard reassurances I tried to apply to it. 3 days after I filed the report, Senior Data Auditor Nara Vell of the Council Archive Division sent me a message. She had reviewed my anomaly report. She wanted to know if I had pulled the full historical dataset on human conflict behavior, because she had run a preliminary cross-reference on the burial data against a different analytical model, and the result had made her want to see the larger picture before she said anything more specific. Nara Vell was 40 years my senior in service. She had personally reviewed and assessed data on over 2,000 civilizations. She was, by every professional measure I could find, one of the most respected data analysts in the Council Archive Division. She did not send messages about Class 3 primitive civilizations. I pulled the full historical dataset. I opened the human conflict file expecting the familiar patterns. Every civilization that reached the industrial age passed through a period of intense territorial conflict, resource scarcity, population pressure, ideological division. These forces produced predictable cycles of violence, then exhaustion, then stabilization, then slow recovery. The Council's models for this cycle were highly refined. They had been tested against thousands of civilizations, and they were reliable. I opened the human conflict file, and the first number I read stopped me completely. In the previous 2 centuries alone, humans had experienced 2 global conflicts of a scale that, by every applicable metric in the Council's standard models, should have resulted in civilizational collapse. Not a serious setback, not a generational wound that would take time to heal. Collapse, the kind from which species do not return. Humans had not collapsed. They had rebuilt, faster the second time than the first. They had taken cities reduced to rubble and raised new ones on the same ground. They had rebuilt their economies from conditions that every Council economic model classified as non-viable for recovery. They had done it while the damage was still fresh, while the losses were still immediate, while the people who remembered the worst of it were still alive. I kept reading. The records went back much further. Plagues that had killed a third of entire regional populations. Famines that had lasted decades, geological and climatic events of a severity that would have triggered emergency intervention requests from most space-faring civilizations, and in the deep historical record. Something that made me stop scrolling entirely. A genetic bottleneck so ancient and so severe that the entire current population of Earth had descended from what the biological modeling estimated to be a surviving group of perhaps only a few thousand individuals. A few thousand people, from whom eventually billions. Humans did not know they had been supposed to end, so they had simply continued. I started a new document. I titled it privately, The Persistence Anomaly Preliminary Notes. I wrote, I do not yet know what this means, but I know it means something. I had no idea, sitting alone with the stars moving past the viewport in slow silence, how completely right that last sentence would turn out to be. Part 2, What the Numbers Say. Naravel arrived at my station, without advance notice, 11 days after I sent her my preliminary notes. She did not message ahead. She did not request docking clearance through the standard channels. She simply appeared at the airlock with a travel case and the concentrated expression of someone who had been thinking about one problem for nearly 2 weeks and had decided that thinking about it from a distance was no longer sufficient. I let her in. I prepared a warm drink the way her service file said she preferred it. She set her case down, took the drink without looking at it, sat at my secondary console, pulled up the full dataset, and said nothing for 40 minutes. I had learned across years of council work that the quality of a person's silence tells you a great deal. There is the silence of boredom, which tends to be loose and slightly restless. There is the silence of confusion, which keeps almost interrupting itself with small sounds. There is the silence of someone reading something they had already half expected to find. Naravel's silence was none of these. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of a conclusion they had not built themselves and were not entirely certain they were ready to accept. When she finally spoke, she asked me only one question. Had I run the resilience index on the full human historical dataset or only on the section covering the last 2 centuries? I said I had only run it on the last 2 centuries, because the drone's most reliable data coverage was concentrated there. She turned to the console and pulled up the full 12,000-year record herself. She ran the calculation from the beginning, while I watched. The Resilience Index was a standard council analytical tool. It measured a civilization's recovery capacity, specifically, how efficiently a species rebuilt its population, technological complexity, and social organization after a catastrophic event. Every known civilization had a Resilience Index score on file. The galactic average was 0.34. Anything above 0.5 was considered exceptional. The Veth Continuum, the oldest continuously existing civilization in council records and widely regarded as the most stable, had held a score of 0.61 for several thousand years, and that number was cited in academic circles with something close to reverence. The algorithm finished its calculation. Naravel looked at the result. The number on the display was 1.7. I had run the same calculation 3 separate times before sending her my notes, with 3 different calibration sets, because I was certain I had made an error. A resilience index above 1 was theoretically possible within the model's mathematical framework, but had never once been recorded in all of the Council's history of observation. What it meant, in plain language, was that a civilization did not merely recover from catastrophic events, but consistently emerged from them in a stronger, more complex, more capable condition than it had been in before the catastrophe. Nara stared at the number for a long time. Then she did what scientists do when a result is too significant to accept on the basis of automated calculation. She pulled up the raw data and began going through it event, by hand. I watched her work for 6 hours. She was methodical in a way that was almost meditative. She moved through plagues and droughts and conflicts and geological disasters, cross-referencing the drone source data against 3 separate council archive databases, looking for any collection error, any modeling assumption that might have inflated the score, any step in the calculation where a reasonable alternative weighting might bring the number back into familiar territory. She recalibrated the parameters twice. She checked the population modeling against independent long-range surveillance data. She rebuilt 2 sections of the analysis from raw inputs rather than the drone's processed output. The number held at 1.7. She finally sat back, picked up the drink she had set down when she arrived, long since cold, and said, without preamble, "The biology." She reached into her travel case and produced a physical copy of a report. It was the full xenobiological survey the Council had quietly commissioned on Earth 15 years prior. It had been filed under routine planetary assessment and had never been flagged for follow-up, because the biologist who authored it had concluded that, while human physiology contained several features of note, none of them appeared directly relevant to the standard criteria for contact readiness evaluation. Nara had read it on the journey to my station. She said the understated language had frustrated her considerably. She opened it to a section she had marked and read it aloud, not because I could not have read it myself, but because hearing certain things stated plainly seemed to help her process them. The section described human pain response. In virtually every other species studied by Council xenobiologists, prolonged or chronic physical pain produced progressive behavioral restriction. The organism withdrew from demanding activities, conserved its energy output, and reduced its range of physical engagement to allow biological recovery. This was the expected pattern. It made evolutionary sense. It was consistent across every comparable species in the database. In humans, prolonged exposure to pain produced something different: adaptation. The nervous system did not continue reporting at peak intensity indefinitely. It found new calibration points. It adjusted. Humans living with ongoing physical difficulty did not become permanently incapacitated. They reorganized. They found new approaches. And a significant portion of them, documented in research paper after research paper that the xenobiological survey cited without apparent awareness of how extraordinary the pattern was, reported that the experience had, counterintuitively, clarified their sense of what mattered to them. Nara set the report on the desk. Then she pulled up the second dataset I had prepared but not yet fully analyzed, the cognitive output study. A correlation chart mapping human technological development rate against the historical record of civilizational stress periods, conflicts, resource shortages, disease events, significant political disruptions. The Council's standard model for technological development assumed a stable and well-established relationship between social stability and the rate of innovation. Peaceful civilizations in periods of prosperity developed new technology faster. Civilizations under acute stress developed it more slowly, because their resources were directed toward immediate survival rather than exploration and invention. This had been confirmed across hundreds of species over thousands of years of observation. It was one of the foundational premises of the Council's civilizational assessment framework. The human data ran in the opposite direction. Human technological acceleration peaks correlated not with periods of peace and prosperity, but with the immediate aftermath of the civilization's most devastating events. The worst global conflicts of the previous century had each been followed within a single generation by extraordinary leaps in medicine, materials science, communication technology, and theoretical physics. Fields of science that had been theoretical abstractions before a period of crisis had become functional disciplines within 30 years of the crisis's end. Naravel looked at the chart for a long time. Then she said, "They do not optimize the way everything else in the database optimizes." I asked what she meant precisely. She said, "Every other species we have ever documented, when it encounters catastrophe, uses its resources to restore what it had. The goal is return to baseline. Even species with high resilience scores are trying to get back to where they were. That is what resilience means in every model we have ever built. Recovery toward a previous condition. She pointed at the peaks on the display. She said, humans use catastrophe as building material. They do not try to return to where they were. They go somewhere they have never been, and they do it in the same breath as rebuilding what they lost. It is as if the loss does not subtract from their capacity to move forward. It redirects it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, there is one more section of the analysis I have not shown you yet. I pulled up the creative output record. The Council's models treated artistic and cultural production as a secondary civilizational behavior, socially valuable, indirectly beneficial to group cohesion and morale, but not a primary indicator of anything the Council's framework measured carefully. But the drone had been collecting this data for 11 years, and when I processed the full record, I found a pattern that would not fit in the secondary behavior category. Humans had continued creating things, writing, painting, composing music, telling stories, making objects that served no functional survival purpose during the worst periods of their worst historical events, not as a luxury practiced by those who had enough surplus. In the middle of their most acute crises, people with almost nothing had made things that would never make them safer or warmer or more fed. And other people had stopped to receive what they made. I had one specific data point that I had returned to many times in the weeks since I found it. An audio recording from the drone's collection. A single human being, somewhere in a city that had been significantly damaged by a recent geological disaster, had sat down at a musical instrument, itself damaged, one note slightly off from what it should have been, and played for nearly 2 hours in a street while the city's emergency services worked around them. No one had asked this person to do it. No organized group had decided it was a good use of their time. There was no ceremony, no occasion, no designated role for what they were doing. 400 people had stopped on their way to, or from the disaster zones to stand in the street and listen. Naravel closed the audio file and was quiet for a moment with a different quality in it, something more personal, less strictly analytical. She said, I have spent my career building models that explain why civilizations are alike. The Council's entire framework rests on the premise that certain patterns are universal, that development follows predictable stages, that a resilience index above 0.7 is remarkable and anything above 1 is not meaningfully possible. She said, I am sitting in front of data that is not asking me to update my models. It is asking me to question the assumptions the models were built on. I asked what she thought we should do. She said, we take this to the full Council, everything in this file, every number that does not fit the expected pattern, every anomaly, every data point the standard framework does not have a category for. We put all of it in front of them and we make it very difficult for them to look away. I asked if she thought the Council would take it seriously. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had watched important data get quietly set aside before and had decided, this time, that it would not happen without a great deal of resistance from her. She said, I intend to make it very difficult for them not to. We spent 3 weeks building the formal dossier. We revised the language until it was as precise and as undeniable as we could make it. We called it, in the formal submission language required by Council protocol, a comprehensive anomaly report, behavioral, biological, and civilizational outlier indicators in species designation Earth-Human, 47 pages, 17 appendices, every calculation verified, every source cited, every conclusion stated as conservatively as the data would permit. We submitted it and requested a full session review, expecting to wait months. The Council scheduled the session for the following week. Naravel looked at that response notification for a long time and then said, very quietly, that she had 2 feelings about it, and was not yet certain which one to trust. I asked which two. She said, encouraged and careful, because in my experience when the council moves quickly, it is either because the matter is simple or because it is very serious, and nothing about this data is simple. Part 3. The council convenes. The council chamber on station Varith Prime had been designed 4,000 years ago by architects who believed that the proper function of space was to diminish the people inside it. The ceiling was a live projection of the known galaxy, rotating slowly in the dark above. The walls were cut from mineral stone threaded with bioluminescent organisms that pulsed in slow, breathing cycles. The floor was polished to a mirror finish that reflected everything above it, so that standing at the central podium felt like standing in open space with stars below your feet as well as above your head. Every proportion, every surface, every detail was calibrated to remind those who stood here that they were very small and that what they were discussing was very large. I had been in this room twice before in my career. Both times I had been seated in the upper observation tiers, watching someone else speak. This time I was at the podium. Naravel stood one step to my left. She had told me the evening before that I would speak first. She said that a young analyst without significant political reputation was harder for the council to dismiss as having an agenda. I said I was not sure that was reassuring. She said she was not trying to reassure me. She was trying to give me accurate strategic information, which was a different thing. 17 delegates occupied the primary tier directly before me. Observers from affiliated research institutions and member civilization advisory bodies filled the tiers above. I had reviewed every delegate's profile and service record in the days leading up to this session. I knew their professional histories, their areas of expertise, the positions they had publicly taken on prior first contact questions. The delegate I paid the most attention to was Oren, representing the Veth continuum. He was seated at the center of the primary tier, which was traditional for the eldest representative, and his eyes had not moved from me since I entered the chamber. Oren had served on this council for longer than I had been alive. When a delegate with that history looked at you with that kind of fixed, measured attention before you had said a single word, it was difficult not to feel the full weight of what you were about to do. I began speaking. I had rehearsed the opening so many times I could have delivered it without thinking. I knew that I had approximately 90 seconds before the ambient professional focus of the room would begin to distribute itself toward other concerns. Council delegates processed enormous volumes of information every single day. They had developed, over long careers, a certain protective distance from presentations that did not immediately demonstrate their relevance. So I did not open with context or background, or any of the procedural scaffolding that most council presentations began with. I put the number on the display. Just the number, nothing else. And then I said, every civilization represented in this chamber today has a resilience index score below 0.7. The galactic average is 0.34. The highest score in the Council's complete recorded history belongs to the Veth continuum, at 0.61, a number that has stood as evidence of exceptional civilizational capacity for over 2,000 years, and is cited in the Council's own educational materials as an example of what is achievable at the highest level of stable development. I paused for 3 seconds. I said, the species I am here to present today scored 1.7. The chamber did not erupt. Council delegates were professionals, but something changed in the room, a density of attention that had not been there before, a stillness replacing the ambient movement of a room full of important people managing important concerns. 16 of the 17 delegates were looking at the display. The 17th, Delegate Oren, was looking at me. I continued. I walked the chamber through the full resilience analysis. I showed the recovery curves following each major catastrophic event in the human historical record. I showed the rate of population rebound after global conflicts and mass mortality events. I showed the documented acceleration of technological complexity in the periods immediately following catastrophe. I showed the consistent and repeating pattern of a civilization that emerged from its worst moments in a stronger condition than before. I presented the biological data next, as Nara Vell had advised. Physiology was measurements. Measurements were harder to dispute than behavioral interpretations. I walked through the pain adaptation findings. I showed the cross-species comparison. I showed the sleep deprivation resilience metrics, the measurement indicating that humans could maintain complex cognitive function under conditions of sustained sleep deprivation that would reduce most known sentient species to functional incapacity within a standard day. I showed the injury recovery data. I showed the immune response adaptation curves. A delegate from the Roe Collective, a civilization approximately 1,200 years old who had always treated the Council's contact readiness framework with something close to doctrinal respect, said, carefully and without hostility, that she did not yet understand the connection between biological resilience and civilizational maturity. Many primitive species had impressive physical characteristics. Physical endurance and adaptability were not, by themselves, indicators of the philosophical or ethical development the Council actually evaluated for contact readiness. I thanked her genuinely and said, "That is exactly the right question, and I am about to answer it." I put up the cognitive output correlation chart. Human technological development rate mapped across 12,000 years of recorded history with the stress events of each era overlaid. The line moved the wrong way. Under pressure, human innovation had not slowed. It had accelerated. I let the room look at it for 15 seconds before I spoke. I walked through the specific examples, the medical advances that had emerged from the worst of the global conflicts, techniques and treatments that had not existed before the catastrophes, developed at extraordinary speed in response to need, retained and built upon after the conflict ended. Fields of science that had been theoretical abstractions before a period of crisis, and that had become functional disciplines within 30 years. I said, the Council's standard model predicts that civilizations under extreme stress develop technology more slowly. Every species in the database confirms this model. Humanity is the single exception in the Council's complete history of observation. This is not a marginal deviation. It is a reversal of the expected direction. I paused. I said, this is a species that learns from difficulty faster than most species learn from peace. Delegate Oren spoke for the first time. His voice carried the unhurried authority of someone who had long since learned that the best way to command a room's attention was to never seem to need it. He said that he found the analysis presented so far compelling, but that the Council had observed civilizations with unusual resilience markers before. The appropriate response was careful and extended monitoring, not accelerated consideration for contact. He asked whether there was any evidence in the data set that these characteristics translated into something beyond survival capacity, whether humans demonstrated the kind of philosophical development that the Council's actual standard for contact readiness was designed to measure. I said, yes, Delegate, there is, and it is the part I have been waiting to show you. I showed them the creative output record, not the celebrated artistic achievements produced during human periods of prosperity and cultural confidence, though there were many of those and they were remarkable on their own terms. I showed them the other record, the letters written in shelters while cities were being damaged above ground, the songs composed in conditions of acute deprivation, the stories told in the dark by communities that had been broken apart, told not to process what had already happened, but to preserve some image of a future that was worth working toward. I showed them the audio recording of the human who had played music in a damaged street for 2 hours while the city's emergency services worked around them. 400 people had stopped to listen, not because anyone asked them to, because the music was there and something in them responded to it. I said, the Council's definition of philosophical development includes evidence that a species has developed a stable orientation toward value that extends beyond the logic of immediate survival. A species which creates beauty and meaning in the middle of its worst moments has demonstrated exactly that orientation, at a scale and consistency that the data does not allow us to set aside. The chamber was quiet in a way I had not felt in it before. Then the secondary delegate of the Veth Continuum, a younger member of Oren's representation body, who had never spoken in a full session in his recorded career, raised his hand and requested live authentication of the drone's data in the chamber's own verification system. It was a formal declaration of doubt. In the Council's unspoken language, it was a suggestion that the data might not be genuine. I heard Nara Vel exhale very quietly beside me. She was already reaching into her case before the request was fully spoken. She placed the drone's primary memory core on the authentication tray. The authentication process used the Council's own architecture, independent of any system Nara Vel or I had access to. It cross-checked the drone's recorded data against 14 independent calibration standards maintained by the Archive Division. The chamber was silent for 14 minutes. The result appeared on the main display. Authentication confirmed. Data integrity 99.97%, within normal sensor collection margin of error. The secondary Veth delegate nodded once and was still. For a moment no one spoke. Then the room divided the way rooms divide when a question is too large for a simple answer. Delegate Oren said he wished to propose a precautionary assessment period for Earth, not permanent isolation, not a hostile designation, a formal, documented, time-limited pause during which the Council could analyze what the data meant before any action was taken. This was, he said, the responsible approach. The Rho Collective delegate said she supported immediate contact authorization. The data indicated a species of extraordinary developmental potential, and the Council's founding principles were about engagement with the universe's civilizations, not about managing distance from them. 6 other delegates indicated support for Oren's pause proposal. 4 indicated support for contact. 3 others, seated at different positions in the tier, from 3 different civilizations, said nothing at all. I watched those 3 delegates. They did not look at each other. They did not look at me. They were looking at the authentication results still showing on the display, and their expressions were the expressions of people who had already reached their conclusions and were waiting with professional patience for the rest of the room to catch up. Nara Vel leaned close and said quietly that we were heading into committee, and that she intended to find out who those 3 delegates were before the session ended. She was right about the committee. After 2 more hours of structured exchange, the Council voted to form a special assessment body to review the complete data package and return with a formal recommendation within 60 days. Earth's status classification would not change in the interim. It was not what we had hoped for. It was not the failure we had feared. Outside the chamber, walking the long corridor back to the transit hub, Nara Vel said, "Those 3 quiet delegates, I need to know who they are." I asked why. She said, "Because in every significant Council decision I have been present for in 40 years, the loudest voices set the terms of the argument. But the outcome is always decided by the ones who already know what they think and are watching everyone else find their way there." I looked back at the chamber doors as we walked away from them. Somewhere beyond them, 17 senior officials were filing out of their seats. Somewhere very far away, on a planet the galaxy had mostly agreed to ignore, people were going about their ordinary day, building things, planting things, writing things down, burying their dead with letters addressed to a future the writers might not live to see. I thought 59 days. I thought that will have to be enough. Part 4, First Contact, Wrong Assumptions. The shuttle broke through cloud cover at 14:32 local time, and I made the mistake of looking out the viewport while it descended. I had processed every technical report ever filed on Earth's surface conditions. I knew the atmospheric composition by precise percentage. I knew the average temperature ranges for every biome on the surface. I had reviewed thousands of high-resolution images captured by orbital survey drones. I believed, when the shuttle door had sealed behind me, that I had a reasonably complete picture of what I was descending toward. I was wrong in the specific way that data cannot fully prepare you for experience. The forests below were a shade of green that did not appear in any reference catalog in the Council's Color Index database. Not a variant, not an approximate match. Genuinely absent, as though 11 years of drone observation had somehow failed to capture what green actually was when you saw it from above, in the afternoon light, at the angle it came through at this time of year in this part of the world. The soil in the cleared areas was a deep reddish-brown that did things with direct sunlight that made it look as though something was alive inside it. A river ran through the low valley where our landing site had been selected, and it threw back a reflection of the sky so precise that for a moment the geometry of the view made no sense. Two skis, one above and one below, with a thin, dark line of earth between them. I looked away from the viewport and focused on the mission briefing document in my hand. The Council's special assessment body had returned its recommendation on the 39th day of the 60 it had been allocated, 19 days ahead of schedule, a margin significant enough that Naravel had taken it as a sign. I had taken it as pressure. The recommendation was conditional first contact, a small team of no more than 3, limited initial disclosure, a priority on passive behavioral observation before revealing our full nature, and an immediate right to withdraw if any threat indicators exceeded baseline thresholds. I was team lead. With me were Shan, a xenopsychologist from the Keth Academic Institute with 23 years of field experience in first contact behavioral response, and Lyra, a communications specialist who had spent 2 decades developing language interface systems for per-contact civilizations, and who had consumed more human linguistic data in the past 3 weeks than most council analysts processed in a career. Both of them were professionals. Both of them were managing the specific quality of stillness that I recognized as controlled anxiety, and both were doing it in the careful, experienced way of people trained to manage such things. The shuttle touched down in the field without incident. It was a good field, wide and flat, with enough clearing distance in every direction to confirm no structures nearby except a low wooden fence along the western boundary, and a barn visible about 300 meters to the north, old enough and weathered enough that it had clearly served several generations of use. The crop variety, a tall grain that moved in the steady wind coming from the northeast, rustled constantly, a sound I had not anticipated, and that turned out to be very difficult to stop noticing. The sky above was the kind of wide that does not register in data. We had been standing outside the shuttle for approximately 6 minutes, conducting our initial environment check and running through the first phase of the contact protocol, when we heard footsteps moving through the crop rows. The human came around the side of the shuttle without any particular urgency, the way someone approaches something on their own property when they want information rather than conflict. She looked at the 3 of us. She looked at the shuttle. She looked back at the 3 of us. She was perhaps 50 years of age by human reckoning. She had a face shaped by many years of outdoor work, not hardened exactly, but settled, as if it had reached a comfortable arrangement with weather and time and the particular demands of this particular piece of land. She was carrying an agricultural maintenance tool in her right hand, a long-handled implement, held relaxed at her side in a way that indicated she had not yet made any particular decision about us. She said, "You are not from around here." It was not a question. Lyra activated the translation interface. 23 months of preparation, 460 hours of calibration work, cross-referenced against every sample of human language in the drone's 11-year collection, and delivered our prepared introduction. We had written and revised it across 11 days. It was measured, carefully sequenced for comprehension, designed to give a human observer multiple points of conceptual anchoring before addressing our extraterrestrial origin directly. The woman listened to the full introduction. She looked at Lyra. She looked at me. She looked at the shuttle again with the evaluating expression of someone adding an item to a list in her mind. Then she said, "All right, what is it you want? Because I have a fence section down on the north side and I was planning to have it sorted before the light goes." Shan made a very small sound beside me. I had studied human behavioral response models for 5 months in preparation for this mission. I had reviewed every theoretical framework the Council's Xenopsychology Division had produced for first contact scenarios. None of the frameworks had included a protocol adjustment for a human whose first substantive response to the announcement of extraterrestrial contact was logistical. I said that we were visitors from beyond this star system, and that our purpose was peaceful contact with the people of Earth. I said that we understood this information was significant and that we were prepared to take whatever time she required to process it. The woman, her name was Claire. She told us this when I asked, adding that she saw no reason to withhold it, nodded. She said she had suspected there was life beyond the stars, same as most people who thought about it seriously. She said she was glad we were peaceful and appreciated us saying so clearly. She had 2 questions. The first question was whether we needed anything to eat, because she had more food at home than she needed, and it seemed wrong not to offer, especially given the distance we had presumably traveled. Shan put her hand briefly over her eyes. I said we did not require food, but that the offer was a genuinely generous response to what must be an unexpectedly extraordinary situation. Claire said it was extraordinary, yes, but it was her field. She felt some responsibility for things that happened in her field, and if you were going to be responsible for something, you had better handle it properly or there was not much point. Her second question was whether we had made contact with anyone else yet, because if we had not, there were people in the village who were going to want to meet us, and knowing this ahead of time might help us prepare. I asked what village. She gestured past the barn, toward a line of trees about 400 meters to the north. Beyond the trees, barely visible, were rooftops. She said the village was called Denham. There were about 300 people living there. They were generally curious and mostly friendly, and she thought things would go more smoothly if she walked us over herself rather than us arriving on our own, because she could do the explaining and people tended to listen to her. Shan leaned toward me. Very quietly she said that none of this matched the contact protocol. I said I was aware of that. She said the protocol specified an extended period of covert observation before direct contact, then controlled disclosure to selected officials, beginning with the highest available governmental authority. Then, a structured response management period of no less than 6 weeks before any broader population awareness was permitted. I said I was aware of all of that. She said we were currently 7 minutes into the mission, and a local farmer was proposing to introduce us to her village. I said that the protocol contained provisions for real-time adaptation in response to conditions that differed materially from projected scenarios. I said this was one of those conditions. I looked at Claire, who was waiting with the patient expression of someone who had decided to be patient, but had a fence to attend to. I said we would be glad to walk with you. Denham had a main road of old fitted stone, a general store at its center, a meeting hall that served as the community gathering space, a school quiet because the children were home for the afternoon, and 312 residents who appeared to learn of our arrival through some communication channel we could not identify within approximately 20 minutes of us walking through the village gate. They came toward us the way a curious community approaches something remarkable, not all at once, not in a rush, but in a steady accumulating flow, each person having made their own decision to come see for themselves. They came from different directions. They arrived at different speeds. What almost none of them showed, in any significant measure, was fear. A man named George, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the unhurried movements of someone long comfortable in one place, took both of my hands in both of his when we were introduced. The gesture was unfamiliar to me, and I mirrored it carefully. He seemed satisfied. He said he had always figured something was out there, and that he was glad it had decided to come by. A group of teenagers arrived together, coming at speed from somewhere nearby. One of them, a girl of perhaps 16 who gave her name as Penny with the directness of someone who found social preamble inefficient, looked at my team with very bright, very focused eyes, and asked immediately whether we used faster-than-light travel or something else entirely, because her physics teacher had told her that FTL was theoretically impossible, and she had always doubted this conclusion. Lyra answered her in detail. Penny absorbed the full answer, asked 3 follow-up questions that demonstrated she had understood it completely, and then said with satisfaction that she was going to write this down, and the teacher was going to have a difficult time maintaining his position. There was a man standing at the edge of the growing crowd who had not come forward and had not spoken. He was holding a professional camera, and he was recording everything. I noticed him when a shift in the crowd opened a sightline, and Claire, following my gaze, said his name was Adam, and he was the local journalist, and I should assume he had already transmitted something to a wider network. Shan covered her eyes again. I asked Claire what wider network meant, practically speaking. She said it meant that within a few hours, a considerable number of people beyond Denham were going to know that something significant had happened in her field. Lyra looked at the contact protocol on her device and was very quiet for a moment. I asked Claire if there was a place where we could sit down together and talk properly. She said the meeting hall had a good table, and she would put on something warm to drink, and then we could figure out together what the sensible next steps were, because that was the practical approach. The table was large wood, worn smooth by many years of use. We sat around it, Claire, George, Penny, Adam with his camera still running, an older woman named Ruth who turned out to be the village's longtime doctor, and who asked the most precisely calibrated biological questions I had received in my entire professional life, and a young man called Finn who said almost nothing the entire evening but watched everything with an attention so steady and complete that I found it, upon reflection, more impressive than most of the senior officials I had briefed the previous month. Lyra handled most of the explanations. I answered the questions she referred to me. Shan sat slightly apart and recorded behavioral observations in silence. Ruth asked about our respiratory requirements and whether the nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere was comfortable for us. Penny asked about a specific theoretical physics problem she had been reading about and whether the council had a unified framework that resolved it. George asked, with genuine curiosity and no discernible anxiety, what it was like to travel between stars. Not in a technical sense, he said, but in the actual experience of it. Adam's camera kept recording. I sent my first encrypted report to Council Station Vareth Prime at 19:47 local time. The protocol had called for 72 hours of silent observation before any contact communication. That window was significantly behind us. The report was 4 sentences. First contact has been made. Second, human behavioral response to extraterrestrial presence shows no significant fear indicators. Social engagement protocols are active and extensive. An offer of food was extended within 7 minutes of initial approach. Third, local information distribution to broader population network appears to be in progress. The covert observation phase specified in the protocol was not achievable under actual contact conditions. Humans appear to have a very limited capacity for leaving extraordinary things unexamined when those things are happening in their immediate vicinity. Fourth, they are not afraid of us. Please advise. I set the communicator down and looked across the table at Claire, who was telling George about the fence section on the north side and how it would need to be addressed before the rain expected on Thursday. 3 hours after confirming the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, she was planning around Thursday's rain. Shan was beside me. She said very quietly, "I have a new hypothesis." I asked what it was. She said, "I do not think human hope is a cultural trait or a learned behavioral pattern. I think it may be physiological. I think it may be structural. I think it may be the underlying cause of every other anomaly in the dataset." Outside the meeting hall, the sky over Denham was doing extraordinary things with color as the day ended, and those colors also had no designation in the Council's reference catalog. And I thought that the Council's reference catalog was going to need a great deal of revision before we were finished here. Part 5, everything changed. 6 months. That was how long it took for the phrase "everything changed" to move from something said dramatically in council corridors to a plain and measurable statement of fact. I was at my desk on the Joint Observation Station in low orbit above Earth, established 4 months prior in a negotiation process that had proceeded faster than any comparable council initiative in living memory, when I pulled up the current partnership status board and counted 11 species with authorized surface research partnerships. 11 separate civilizations, each with a formal agreement in place, each with active personnel on the ground below me, each sending back reports with the particular quality of energy that people produce when they encounter a way of looking at the universe that their own training had not prepared them to expect. The quarantine motion had failed. It had failed quietly, which Nara Vel had told me the morning after was the more permanent kind of failure. Loud defeats could be reversed when circumstances shifted and energy rebuilt. Quiet defeats happened when the world had simply moved on and made the motion obsolete before anyone formally acknowledged it. The motion had lost because of the science divisions. 3 of the Council's most respected long-term research programs had, within the same 8-week window, submitted independent formal requests to include human co-researchers in their active field teams. Deep Space Geological Survey, Theoretical Propulsion Physics, Xenobiological Resilience Study, which had a quality of irony that Nara Vel and I had noted to each other without saying much about it. 3 separate disciplines, 3 separate reasons, 3 different research directors who had looked at the preliminary data on human cognitive output patterns and had, each in their own way, reached the same conclusion. They wanted someone like that on their team. Delegate Oren had not voted against the quarantine motion. He had abstained, and that abstention, from the delegate of the eldest civilization in the Council, from the voice that had been most measured in its caution throughout the chamber session, had been understood by everyone present for exactly what it was. I had not been in the chamber for that vote. I had been in Denham, at Claire's kitchen table, while she asked me questions about the Council's governance structure, and got up periodically to tend to something in the garden, because the afternoon light was at the right angle and certain tasks would not wait for conversations to finish. The table at Claire's kitchen had become, without any formal designation, a kind of regular meeting. She had produced a schedule on my 3rd visit, matter-of-factly, as though it had always been obvious that we would need one. I came down from the station on rotations that matched her availability. Sometimes Penny was there, sending detailed messages to 3 council physicists who had begun to find the correspondence genuinely stimulating. Sometimes Finn was there, mostly quiet, watching and thinking in the way I had come to understand was not passivity but preparation. Finn had submitted a formal research partnership application 2 months ago. He had listed his area of interest as observational synthesis and what he called lateral problem framing, the specific practice of identifying the useful question that the available evidence suggested, but that no one currently working in a field had yet thought to ask. The review board had spent 4 weeks evaluating it. They had approved it last Tuesday. He was 24 years old. I was thinking about all of this, watching the slow, bright curve of Earth's sunlit edge through my station viewport, when the message arrived from Delegate Oren requesting a private meeting. No formal session, no official agenda, a conversation one-to-one at a time of my choosing at whatever location I preferred. I forwarded the message to Naravel, who was 3 levels below me on the research deck, currently in what sounded from her last message like an enthusiastic and extended disagreement with 2 human physicists about a theoretical paper they were writing together. She replied within a minute, "I told you to watch the quiet ones." I met Oren the following morning in the station's observation room, which had a full-wall viewport facing Earth's daylit hemisphere and no chairs, because the original designers had believed that standing encouraged shorter meetings. The room had, since the station opened, become one of the places where people came simply to look at the planet without being expected to do anything else. There was nearly always someone there. Oren arrived before me. He was standing at the viewport with his hands at his sides, looking at the planet below. He did not turn when I entered. For a long moment he continued looking at the white spiral of cloud moving slowly over the ocean, and I stood behind him and waited. Then he said, "I voted for the assessment committee because I wanted to slow the process down. I have been using committee processes to give the council time to think carefully for 9,000 years. It is generally a reliable approach." I said I understood. He turned from the viewport. The expression on his face was not the controlled professional gravity he had worn in the chamber. There was something more open in it, the quality of a person who had set down something heavy and was still taking stock of how that felt. He said, "The Veth Continuum stopped conducting deep space exploration 2,000 years ago. It was a rational decision. We had mapped a substantial portion of reachable space and had found, on balance, that the regions beyond our surveyed boundary were likely to be similar to what we already knew. The cost of going further was very large. The projected return was modest by every analysis our economists and strategists produced. We had what we needed. We had what we had built. We had built it carefully and well, and we had every reason to protect it." I said nothing. I waited. He said, "I have been reading the human data for 6 months. Not only the material presented in the chamber, everything. I requested access to the full communication archive from Lyra, and she provided it. I have been spending my evenings reading human letters and news records and scientific arguments and personal conversations and accounts of small things that made people glad. I have been doing this at the end of my official working day, which is an unusual use of my time, and several members of my staff have noticed and have not commented on it, which is itself a specific kind of data." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want you to explain something to me. The Veth Continuum had a resilience index of 0.61, and we were proud of that number. We had reasons to be proud. We built something that could endure. We built something that functioned across millennia without the catastrophic failures that ended so many others. We believed that this was the achievement, stability, continuity, the preserved integrity of what we had constructed." He looked back at the viewport. He said, "The data you presented suggests that humans do not optimize for preservation, and I have been trying to understand for 6 months what they optimize for instead, because I have approached it from many directions, and I do not have a word for it in my language. I am not certain the Council has a word for it in any of its working languages." I thought about how to answer him honestly, and in a way that was worthy of the question he was actually asking. I thought about Claire planning around Thursday's rain 3 hours after confirming the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, not because the magnitude of the situation had not reached her, but because the rain was also real, and the fence was also real, and both things deserved attention. I thought about Penny making her physics teacher technically incorrect and writing it down carefully not to embarrass him, but because the information was important and should be accurately recorded. I thought about Finn watching everything, saying almost nothing, and submitting a partnership application 3 months into knowing the council existed, because he had ideas that needed a context large enough to develop them in. I thought about a letter placed in the dark beside someone who was gone. I said, I think humans optimize for what comes next. Oren was still. I said, every other civilization I have reviewed the record of optimizes for what it has already built. The purpose of the civilization is to protect what exists, to extend it carefully where extension is clearly safe, to refine it over time, to ensure that what has been constructed continues to function well into the future. That is a rational and genuinely honorable goal. It produced your civilization, and it has maintained it across 9,000 years, and that is something extraordinary and worth protecting. I said, but humans look at what they have built, and the first thing they want to know is what can be built next, not in a way that requires abandoning what already exists. They simply cannot stop being curious about what is on the other side of what is currently visible. The universe is still mostly unexplored, and to humans every unexplored region is not primarily a risk to be assessed before proceeding. It is an invitation. And invitations, in their understanding of things, are meant to be accepted. Oren turned from the viewport and looked at me. He said, we stopped because the cost was high and the expected return was modest. I said, yes. He said, and humans would disagree with the framing of that calculation. I said, I think humans would have difficulty understanding why modest expected return was ever considered a sufficient reason to stop looking. I think they would say that the return on exploration is not in what you find. It is in what you become in the process of going further. It is in who you are when you arrive somewhere that you could not have imagined from where you started. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, I am going to request a human liaison for the Veth Continuum's Exploration Archive Division. I am going to write the request myself rather than routing it through the standard committee process. I said I thought that was a good decision. He said, I want you to know that I do not regret voting for the committee. I believe the council needed the time. Some of us needed the time to get where we needed to be. I said, I understand that. He said, but I am glad the time is over. He looked at Earth one more time. Then he nodded to himself or to the planet or to something he had decided, and he left the room. I stayed at the viewport for a while. Later that afternoon I walked the station's main concourse, which had been extended 3 months prior to accommodate the increase in cross-species traffic that no one had formally planned for but everyone had quietly known was coming. It was busy in the way of places where important work is happening, and people are glad to be doing it. I passed 2 Veth researchers in an animated conversation with Kate, a human biologist who had been on the station for 2 months, and who had developed the reputation of asking questions that made scientists who had been working in their fields for centuries stop and reconsider things they had assumed were fully resolved. I passed a group of human students from what they called a university, here on a week-long exchange with the Council's stellar cartography team, all of them moving through the corridors with the bright, forward-leaning energy of people who have just realized how much more there is to know. I passed Lyra talking with a human communications engineer about building a better interface, and both of them were talking fast and interrupting each other in the way of people who are making something together and cannot move fast enough to keep up with it. I went to the viewport at the end of the concourse and stood there. The planet was in late afternoon on its surface, which at this altitude meant the western curve was still bright, and the eastern edge was beginning to tip into the shadow of night. I watched the Terminator line, that slow, steady boundary between light and dark, move in its precise and unhurried way, and I thought about what I would have told you if you had asked me on the day I opened a drone data file because I had nothing better to do while my navigation system worked. About a Class 3 primitive civilization on a small blue world with one moon. I would have told you, unremarkable, worth monitoring, not yet ready for consideration. I would have been wrong in every direction that mattered. Naravel came to stand beside me. She did not announce herself, as usual. We stood together looking at the planet for a while without speaking, which was something we had developed the habit of doing. She said, "The first deep field mission with a human co-researcher departs in 40 days. Kate is going. Finn is going. His partnership was approved last week, and the review board cited observational synthesis and lateral problem framing as his primary contribution area, which is the formal way of saying that he sees things other people do not see, and then thinks about them in ways no one else has tried yet." I said, "That sounds right." She said, "The ship is called Persistence. The human crew named it. No one on the council raised any objection." I looked at her. She was looking at the planet. She said, "I have been thinking about something you said to Oren." I asked what. She said, "You told him that the return on exploration is not in what you find. It is in what you become in the process of going further, in who you are when you arrive somewhere you could not have imagined from where you started." I said I had said something like that, yes. She said, "I have been wondering whether that is something a civilization can learn if it has spent a long time not doing it, or whether it requires a certain kind of starting point, something you either have or you do not have." I said I did not know. She said, "I think it can be learned. I think the condition is contagious. I think spending time near something that keeps moving toward the horizon without stopping teaches you to notice the horizon yourself, in a way that simply knowing the horizon exists never quite does." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I filed a request to join the second deep field mission. The committee will review it and debate it for approximately 2 months and then approve it. I am comfortable with the 2 months because I have things to do in the meantime, and the mission will still be there when the committee finishes." I said I was glad. She said, "You know, when your anomaly report came into my queue, I almost wrote a brief dismissal and returned to my other work. I had 3 active civilizational assessments and a substantial backlog of historical audit requests. I had no particular reason to spend time on an automated flag about burial practices on a Class 3 primitive world." I asked what stopped her. She said, "The image. A letter placed in the dark beside someone who could no longer read it. I sat with that image for a day and I could not fit it into any of the categories I had spent my career building. And when something does not fit your categories, you have 2 choices. You can decide that the thing is wrong, or you can decide that your categories are not large enough." She paused. She said, "I have spent 40 years building categories. I am genuinely proud of some of them, but the thing in front of me was real and the categories were not large enough for it, and I have always believed that real things take precedence over the frameworks we use to describe them." I thought about that. She said, "A species that writes letters to the dead is not writing to the person who is gone. They know that person is gone. They are writing to the future. They are writing to the version of themselves that will exist after the grief has changed shape. They are writing to the community that will come after the loss. They are writing to whoever finds the letter, if anyone ever does. They are making an act of faith that the future is real and worth addressing directly, even when the present is as difficult as it gets. That is not ritual. That is not irrational behavior persisting beyond its developmental usefulness. That is a species that has decided, at a level so deep it requires no conscious decision, that what comes next is worth preparing for. I said, and you think that is what Oren could not find a word for. She said, I think it is what the council did not have a word for, and I think having it nearby is going to change that. Words arrive when you have enough examples of the thing they need to describe. We are about to have a great many examples. She pushed away from the viewport. She said, I need to finish a paper I am writing with Kate before she leaves on the mission. We have been working on it for 3 weeks, and we are close to something. She walked back down the concourse. I stayed at the viewport. Below me, in a facility on the planet's surface, a ship called Persistence was being prepared for a journey that would take it further into deep space than any human-built vessel had ever gone. On the manifest, listed as a crew member, Finn, observational synthesis, age 24. Among the mission objectives, submitted by Kate in a document already circulating through 3 council research departments, a new framework for understanding the relationship between civilizational difficulty and adaptive capacity. Whether hardship is, as the data suggested, not the opposite of growth, but sometimes the engine of it. Somewhere in Denham, Claire was in her garden or at her kitchen table, or dealing with the fence section that always seemed to need attention. Somewhere, Adam was recording something. He had been recording steadily since the first evening, and the archive he was building had become, quietly, one of the most accessed human documents in the Council's New Earth Exchange database. Somewhere, Penny was writing something down. Several Council researchers were waiting to read it. And somewhere, in an ordinary place, on a day with no ceremony around it, someone was writing a letter they planned to bury. Not because the person who would receive it could ever read it, because the future was real and worth addressing, and because hope was not a feeling they waited to have. It was a practice they carried with them the way they carried everything else, through the dark, through the loss, through the long, ordinary, extraordinary work of building something that might outlast them. I had been sent to Earth as a low-priority posting. It was where the Council sent analysts it had forgotten about, where junior careers went to wait until something more important came along. I was the luckiest analyst in the history of the Galactic Council. I knew that now with the kind of certainty that does not require verification, not because of what had happened in the chambers and committees and formal sessions of the past 6 months, but because of what it felt like to stand at a viewport and look at a planet that had survived 11 near extinctions and was currently, somewhere in its bright afternoon, planning for Thursday's rain. Below me, on the sunlit side of the world, the light was doing something extraordinary with the water and the land and the air between them, something that had no designation in any reference catalog I had ever accessed. I stood at the viewport and looked at it for a long time, because looking at things was something I had learned in the past 6 months to do with more patience and more attention and more genuine willingness to let what I was seeing be more than I had expected. It was a habit I intended to keep.